All right. Welcome everyone to California Law Review's Democracy Reform Symposium. I think we're just gonna wait maybe 1 minute to let everybody get into the Zoom. We're so excited you're here, and I hope your day is going well. Or if you're in California, as well as it can be right now. All right, we've got a bunch more people joining. Okay, maybe 20 more seconds. All right, well, I think that number is still climbing, but I'm just going to go ahead and get started because I'm sure everyone has more Zooms lined up for this afternoon. So I'd like to welcome everybody again to the California Law Review's 2020 Symposium, Democracy Reform for the 21st Century. My name is Casey Reed. My pronouns are she, hers, and I am a third-year student at Berkeley Law, and I'm also the Law Review Symposium editor. So I'm just going to quickly thank a few people, starting with our incredible panelists, including those who are joining us today, our keynote speaker, Sabeel, Rahman, and our incredible partner, Bleich, as well as all the other participants that we'll be hosting throughout the end of this week and next week. Everyone has been so patient and flexible and really committed as we navigated rescheduling this symposium in a global pandemic, and I'm very grateful for your continued support and engagement in this event over the past several months. I also want to thank all the audience members who are choosing to spend some extra time on Zoom today to join this conversation. This is an incredibly different time for all of us in lots of different ways, but we're at least grateful that this new virtual format can bring more of you, more people into these really important conversations about the future and the equity of our democracy. The state of our nation feels very chaotic and really terrifying at times, but we hope that you'll be able to take away a bit of inspiration from this symposium and from hearing people who are fighting for social and racial justice in our institutions and systems every day. And finally, I just wanted to thank the California Law Review team and the Berkeley Law Events team for all your hard work in making this happen. And I'm going to hand the mic, so to speak, over to Sam Lim, our wonderful editor-in-chief. But I just wanted to clarify a few logistics. So if there are any technical issues, we have some Zoom techs on the line. So we will be working through those. We apologize in advance for any glitches. And around 1:45 or potentially a little bit earlier, our keynote speaker, Sabeel Rahman, will be taking your questions, which you'll be able to share via Zoom's Q&A function. So please feel free to jot down those questions for yourself throughout his remarks so that you can ask your question. And finally, we are recording all of these sessions just for your awareness so that we can post these videos on our website with closed captions as they happen. So with that, thank you all again for being here, and I'm going to hand things over to Sam.
Super. Thank you so much, Casey. And hello, everybody. My name is Sam Lim. As Casey said, I'm the editor-in-chief of the California Law Review. I use he, him, his pronouns. And I want to welcome you to our 2020 Symposium, Democracy Reform for the 21st Century. Let me begin by reading our land acknowledgement for where CLR is situated in Berkeley. And if you're not in Berkeley, we encourage you to look into the land history of where you are geographically located. California Law Review recognizes that Berkeley sits on the territory of Huichin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone, the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold the University of California, Berkeley more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. In recognition that California Law Review benefits from this history, we pay the Shumee land tax as a small way to contribute to the healing of this history, the sovereignty of Ohlone people, and the preservation of their culture. As our marketing materials reference, this symposium is happening months after it was originally planned as an in-person gathering back in April. But as we know, COVID has upended many well-laid plans, and indeed the ways in which COVID has impacted so many aspects of daily life has also exposed the stark disparities that exist within our democracy, exacerbating gaps in access to education, healthcare, capital. And this acute inequality was further underscored with the police killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and countless other Black people. But the ensuing movement for racial justice that continues still underscores even more the importance of the conversations that we'll engage in over the coming week to identify needed solutions for reforming our democracy. So to avoid a long day on Zoom, we've spread out our 6 panels over the next 8 days, and we'll record them and make them available on our website, as Casey mentioned, to reach an even broader audience. But we encourage you to attend as many of these critical conversations as you can. We have an incredible slate of speakers, and we cannot thank them enough for being a part of this symposium. I also just want to quickly thank especially our symposium editor, Casey Reed, for her tremendous leadership in rescheduling the symposium, and the numerous CLR members spanning volumes 108, 109, and 110 who've contributed so much behind the scenes. And I'd be remiss not to also thank our Berkeley Law Event Services for their invaluable support in getting all of our web technology set up. And of course, I have to thank our incredible symposium partner, Jeff Bleich, without whom this symposium would not be happening, and whom I now have the profound honor of introducing. From 2009 to 2016, Jeff served in the Obama administration as special counsel to the president, U.S. ambassador to Australia, and senior advisor to the director of national intelligence. During a 3-decade legal career, Jeff has represented numerous tech companies specializing in cybersecurity and complex international disputes, beginning with Microsoft's first cyber breach case. He also served as counsel in numerous cases He also served as counsel in numerous cases before the U.S. and California Supreme Courts, including several landmark pro bono cases on behalf of immigrants, LGBTQ service members, racial and religious minorities, victims of gun violence, veterans, homeless youth, foster youth, and victims of domestic violence. Prior to joining the Obama administration, Jeff was a partner for 17 years at Munger, Tolles & Olson in San Francisco, where he handled many significant pro bono civil rights matters and was recognized as one of the nation's top lawyers. Jeff has held several other leadership positions, including chair of the Fulbright Board, chair of the California State University Board of Trustees, president of the California State Bar, president of the Bar Association of San Francisco, and president of the Baristas Club of San Francisco. In 1998, Jeff was appointed by President Clinton to serve as director of the White House Commission on Youth Violence following the tragic Columbine shootings. Jeff holds a BA magna cum laude from Amherst College, where he lettered in 3 sports, an MPP from Harvard with highest honors, where he founded the Kennedy School's Humor magazine, and a JD from the University of California, Berkeley with highest honors, where he was editor-in-chief of the California Law Review. And Jeff's connections to Berkeley are quite extensive, as he's taught several courses at Berkeley Law and has been recognized with several awards, including CLR Alumni of the Year, UC Berkeley Law Young Alumnus of the Year, and most recently, the University of California, Berkeley Peter Haas Public Service Medal. And Jeff clerked for Chief Justice William Rehnquist on the U.S. Supreme Court, Judge Abner Mikva of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, and Judge Howard Holtzman of the Iran U.S. Claims Tribunal at The Hague. And currently, Jeff serves as Chief Legal Officer at Cruise LLC, which is building autonomous vehicles in the Bay Area. And Jeff loves dogs and cats, obscure sports, bad movies, and most of all, his wife, Becky, and their 3 kids. Please join me in welcoming Jeff Bleich.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Samson. I don't know how to respond to all that, but I'm very honored to be here to welcome you all to the 2020 California Law Review Symposium, Democracy Reform in the 21st Century. But before I start, I really do want to thank you, Sam, for serving as editor-in-chief of CLR Volume 109. It's a job I promise you'll look forward to looking back on. And to Casey Reed, the Symposium editor, I'm just grateful for the extraordinary work that you both put in, just organizing the symposium in the midst of a global pandemic, wildfires, power outages, civil unrest. We've got orange skies now, and any day now we're expecting asteroids and locusts. So it took extraordinary effort to pull this off, and extremely grateful to you. I'm also grateful to the Volume 108 team, the editor-in-chief, Nora Hassan, the managing editor, Alex Copper, and the symposium editor, Christina Mora, who selected this program. They really laid the groundwork for this week's discussions. And just as you thank them, I also want to thank the Berkeley Law Events Services staff for really heroic efforts in setting up this first ever virtual symposium. Finally, I want to especially thank Ted Dintersmith, who not only advocated for this program, but who did what great citizens do. You know, he put his time, he put his energy, and he put his resources behind the effort to improve our democracy and to truly make it a more perfect union. You know, we all know that just doing the basic parts of citizenship are tough. It's not easy. You know, voting, serving on juries, paying your taxes, learning issues, taking positions, honoring elections, and even decisions that don't go your way. Sometimes just putting your own you know, time into civic efforts, or putting your own life on the line, or the life of someone you love, to protect the democracy. And then doing this over and over again, no matter how tired or disappointed you are, or how cynical the times may be. And Ted is one of those unsung heroes of a democracy, a person who takes the responsibilities of citizenship seriously. Democracies live because of people like Ted, and they die when too many of us stop doing what Ted has done. And that's at the core of this symposium. It's a basic question. If we keep on the current course, what will life be like for a future citizen of the United States? Will US citizens have the power to directly elect leaders based on the majority of their votes? Will they all have access to vote? Will their votes be counted regardless of where they live? Will their votes count equally? Will they be able to trust the voting system? Will they be informed enough to make good choices? And will they have institutions like political parties and news outlets that actually evaluate and test whether the candidates running for office can fulfill their constitutional duties? Will our education system actually prepare Americans to be engaged and informed citizens? Will Congress and the courts respect the will of the people and maintain separation of powers? And will the majority of these elected leaders make it their first priority to ensure a safer and more just society in which citizens enjoy the equal protection of the law and due process and a right to privacy and freedom to travel and to associate, to worship, to speak, and to enjoy the blessings of liberty? I think anyone taking an honest look at the current trajectory today would say no. Future citizens would have none of those things. And we have gone off course. And it's time for a course correction to restore the basic democratic principles of America. Now, I was the EIC of CLR here 31 years ago, which is why I can joke with Sam. And at that time, you know, Berkeley students, we had a lot of debates about democracy. We debated the normal stuff, you know, in Fed courts and in con law, you know, the power of the federal government versus the reserved powers of the states. We debated separation of powers and limits on executive power. We debated the limits of, you know, one person, one vote. And we debated We debate the balance of interests, the checks and balances that are at the core of a functioning democracy. But the one thing that was different is that we never seriously debated whether democracy was better than the alternatives. We didn't debate whether our democracy could last. We understood that no matter what, we wanted a society where each of us has a say in choosing our leaders and the ability to hold them accountable. But in the 30 years since, this has changed. There's been a convergence of forces that have distorted and weakened and eroded confidence in democracies all across the world. Some of this is just age. You know, it's been 250 years since democracy started proliferating around the world. And these new nations conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all people are created equal were no longer new nations. Their citizens were a dozen generations and billions of lives removed from their founders. And too many citizens just barely knew anymore how or why their nation had even started. Members of democracy started to forget what life was like without democracy. It just seemed to have always been there, for better or worse, and they took it for granted or neglected it. But more importantly, the last 30 years have brought some new technologies that, unchecked, have had corrosive effects on democracy. New media, new polling techniques, new surveillance methods have evolved to slice and dice and dissect and influence and marginalize the demographic. Parties developed messages that deliberately cleaved the electorate in predictable ways and kept them focused on issues that kept those parties in power, frankly, rather than solving the citizens' problems. Both parties consolidated power by drawing voting districts that favored them. They supercharged the vote of supporters and in some cases suppressed the votes of those who opposed them. They ignored the rights of people in territories and districts whose votes didn't count, and they exploited these antiquated rules that made some votes count more than others. Then new global technologies compounded these effects. Americans were losing their political voice precisely when they needed it most. Global technologies changed the economic prospects for many Americans and left them feeling abandoned. Americans lost confidence that they were likely to have a better life than their parents did, and statistics confirmed that those fears were true. The proof that our democracy is not working properly is that it hasn't responded to this effect. Government leaders have talked about responding, but if anything, both parties simply doubled down on the status quo. They became more beholden to their financial bases, and instead of calling them out, the media has been complicit, slicing up viewers by party affiliation and conjuring stories that would keep their viewers watching. And eventually citizens have gotten the message that governing is not a serious business. It's a competition between special interests and a form of entertainment for the media to sell. It's no longer about us, and citizens have lost interest. Today, 2/3 of American adults can't name the 3 branches of government. And as voting percentages and citizen engagement has fallen, this has only made it easier to game the democratic process. Leaders have weakened institutions, including access to voting, and Americans have increasingly expressed a loss of confidence in democracy itself, in the very meaning of democratic self-governance. So in 2016, polls showed historic lows in Americans' approval of their government, of democracy, of the media, and of the parties. That year, the citizens elected a president who promised to blow the whole thing up. And he has systematically gone after the institutions of a functioning democracy. He's threatened to defund the postal service so that people can't vote. He's called the media the enemy of the people. He's shut down the government and threatened to defy the courts. He's enlisted foreign nations to keep him in power. He's used the military to disperse peaceful protests. And he's generally served as a living embodiment of a system in which only the wealthiest and most powerful interests have the ability to select the nation's leaders. As one of my friends, a diplomat from South America, said to me, "We've all seen this movie before. We've just never seen it in English." The vision for this forum was just a series of questions about how we could change this course. What would it take to make democracy in the United States work as promised? What reforms would be needed to accomplish three simple principles: to ensure that every person can and does vote, that every vote counts equally, and that the will of the people as expressed in their votes isn't thwarted by non-democratic forces. America's faced this before, these same questions. At the turn of the last century, we faced the same troubles, but we reformed our government. We passed two constitutional amendments, one that made voting available for the largest disenfranchised entity in American history, women. More than half the population had been disenfranchised. We provided for popular election of voters. We instituted a civil service. We passed anti-corruption laws and transparency laws, and we rebuilt a government that became more responsive to the people again. Now, no one has all the answers for the questions that face us today. The person I'm about to introduce has more than the most of us. I'm very proud and very grateful to welcome as our keynote speaker a person who's devoted his great intelligence, his phenomenal energy, and all of his gifts fully to these vital questions. Dr. Sabeel Rahman is the president of Demos. It's a think tank and a do tank that seeks to restore democratic power to all Americans. He's the child of Bangladeshi immigrants. Dr. Rahman earned his undergraduate degree, his law degree, and his doctorate at Harvard University, as well as picking up master's degrees at the University of Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. In addition to Demos, he teaches constitutional law at Brooklyn Law School, and everything he does is an author, scholar, activist, and grassroots leader. All of his work is devoted to making our society more inclusive and democratic, and our economy more equitable. His new book, Civic Power, looks at how to build a more inclusive and empowered bottom-up democracy. And so there truly is no one better to kick off this symposium. Sabeel, thank you for being here. We're honored to have you.
Thanks so much, Jeff, for that introduction and for your remarks. We're so appreciative of all your leadership and all your work as well. And thank you too to the leaders of the symposium, Casey, Sam, Julianne, the Cal, Larview team, the Berkeley team, and all of you for joining this conversation. It's a challenging and urgent time to have this conversation, particularly thinking of those of you who are tuning in from California and seeing, I'm calling in from New York myself, and we're all kind of seeing the images playing out in real time, on social media and on the TV. And I really appreciate Jeff's opening frame, because I think this, a lot of times when we talk about democracy and democracy reform, it can take a sort of theoretical quality, right? Like, how do we improve participation or increase civic virtue, the smooth functioning of the system? But of course, we're at a moment where this question about democracy is not theoretical, and it's not a nice to have. Right? It's deeply urgent and is closely, intimately connected with the real life and death struggles of so many Americans, so many people around the world. Right? We're entering into this conversation in the middle of a pandemic that has already claimed 190,000 lives, predominantly in Black and Brown communities. We're seeing the continued epidemic of anti-Black violence, both state-sponsored and paramilitary violence on Black communities. The climate catastrophe in not just in California with hurricanes in the Gulf and all around the country is underscored so sharply today. And amidst all of this, the most powerful tool that we have to solve these collective problems, to create the kind of conditions that promote the flourishing of our communities, is democratic tools to force government to respond to those needs, right? Jeff mentioned responsiveness as a key feature of democracy. But of course, we're at a moment where all the tools that we have on hand are being attacked in real time, dismantled in real time, and it's not clear that they were operating in the ways that they needed to operate even before the current administration. So as a opening for the symposium, for the conversations that you all will be having over these next several days, I really want to set the larger context about the historical context, but also the conceptual context of sort of what is the landscape, the universe of democratizing fights that we are taking on right now and that we need to take on in the years to come. Because it's not just about November, it's not just about one election, it's really about the project for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And I think Jeff is exactly right to also remind us of the legacy of transformational democratic change, democratizing change. And I think that's the level of ambition that we need to have. So to kind of give the punchline first at the outset, to be a little bit provocative, I mean, I think I would love for us to think about this conversation not in terms of how do we advance democracy reform to improve an already functioning democracy, but actually, if we were to change our view and think about what does it look like to be fighting for democracy reform in a polity that has arguably ceased to function or maybe never functioned as a democracy really. And that's a different stance. And I think it opens up a bunch of different fights that we need to fight, but also a bunch of different opportunities for transformative and not just incremental change. And that's what I want to talk about here. So what I'm going to spend the next few minutes on is first give a few remarks about the historical arc of what I think brought us here, then say a little bit about the diagnosis of what are those big long-term structural fights that any democracy reform agenda needs to take on, which includes, of course, the right to vote, but much more than that, as Jeff alluded in his comments. And then third is I want to talk concretely about some of the immediate policy fights and ways forward. That there's just so much happening right now. It's a moment of great peril, but also tremendous powerful organizing and creativity and really bold ideas that are moving through the landscape. And I do want to talk about that as well. So to start with the history a little bit, as Jeff mentioned, I'm also a constitutional law professor, so I can't resist. Those of you who are in law school will forgive this this way of starting, but I do want to start with a case. And it's not the case that we usually start our constitutional law classes with, right? You usually would start with Marbury or McCullough, depending on your professor. But I want to start with the case of US v. Cruikshank, which is a case from 1876. And what it's really about is the Colfax Massacre. And so this is at the high water mark of Reconstruction, the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. And it's a time where we passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and you're actually seeing a tremendous upsurge of Black electoral power in terms of Black elected officials at all levels of government, grassroots organizing of Black voters. And you have a local election in Colfax, Louisiana, in the 1872 election, where Republicans and the party of, still very much the party of Lincoln, and made up of mostly Black freed persons in the district, in the county, win the local election. But then there's a standoff because the opposition organized a paramilitary force and threatened the certification of the election. There's a standoff, and then it ultimately results in a massacre of, the count ranges anywhere from 150 to 300 Black freed persons who were who had holed up in the courthouse to certify the elections. And were attacked by a group of white paramilitaries led by William Cruikshank, among others. And so then a court case ensues. Congress, after the 14th Amendment, had passed a series of civil rights and enforcement acts to help local prosecutors go after these paramilitary groups. You can imagine the whole scene. There's witness intimidation. The DA is having trouble making the case, makes the case, secures a conviction. The Supreme Court then intervenes and throws the case out in 1876. And if you read the case, read the opinion, it's kind of all over the place. But what's really going on here, of course, is a judicial intervention to sanction the off-the-books paramilitary violence, which was deployed to nullify the results of the election in Colfax County. And I want to start there because it this moment captures a lot of what I think we're really up against in this moment in 2020, right? The first lesson of this moment to me is that the battle for American democracy that we're in the fight against a slide into authoritarianism or autocracy. It's not just about the current moment. There are modern day threats that Jeff alluded to, which I'll talk about in a minute. But we have our own sort of homegrown American tradition, as it were, of autocracy that we've been fighting against for a long time. And the Koufax massacre, the Cruikshank case, really highlights that this is a long-running historical problem. And it's not just about the vote, but it's about who gets to vote and who counts, right? It's specifically about this idea of, can American democracy be a multiracial democracy in which Black and brown communities have full equal standing and dignity as members of the polity? That's really the question, right? Because what we find is in the years that follow is that democracy, sometimes we think that there's support for the idea of American democracy, but it turns out it's, we're fine with democracy when it's for some folks, but not for everybody. So the Koufax case highlights the centrality of race, the centrality of of our own American tradition of autocracy, which is Jim Crow and white supremacy. And it also highlights that what we're up against is a complex interplay between law, between civil society actors, grassroots actors. It's about sort of power on the ground as well as power in the courts, and it's about legislative as well as constitutional change. And so if you fast forward then 100 years, right, a big part of why it takes until 1964 to get the the Civil Rights Act, and 1965 to get the Voting Rights Act is because of cases, moments like Cruikshank, right? These episodes where the late 19th century court and late 19th century politics really slams the door shut on the emancipatory and democratizing vision of the Reconstruction Amendments, of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And that sort of creates this long period of Jim Crow, which then gets challenged by the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s, culminating in, among other things, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And we can think of that moment as kind of a second Reconstruction, a sequel to that moment of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But that moment also then provokes its own backlash, similar in a lot of ways to what we saw in the Cruikshank case, right? So if you think about what happens after 1964, the parties realign, you have the rise of the Nixonian conservative movement, which really starts to fuse a coalition assembled among big business, constituencies resistant to desegregation, social conservatives. They share a common critique of big government, but also there's this undercurrent about race and a racialized understanding of democracy and of the economy. And so the lesson here then is that the backlash against democracy that we saw in a case like Cruikshank, it's still very much there, but it operates through other channels. You see different debates about social policy, for example, about the welfare state, or different ideas about who the polity should serve. But it hadn't yet, at that point, gotten to the point of a direct attack on voting rights and the electoral system. So now that gets us to the present. And I think there's a lot of ways in which, even before we got to the Trump administration, that we could understand some of the challenges and tensions of American democracy as being a sequel, or in this case, a part 3 of this story of the kind of battling back and forth between, are we going to be an inclusive multiracial democracy or not? And so when you think about cases like the Shelby County case, like Citizens United, these cases that, under somewhat plausible, depending on your read, legal theories, really start to undermine and erode the efficacy and responsiveness of our electoral system, right? By undercutting the Voting Rights Act, by creating more room for corporate money and to skew our elections. And so there are these pieces that are getting put in place even before the sort of like brazen and open attacks that we see now on the legitimacy of vote by mail, say, or of the Postal Service. So all of that, I mean, that's a very potted, short history, which we can talk about more in the Q&A, but for me, there are a couple of implications of this. One, of this story. One is that the fight for democracy is fundamentally, centrally also a fight about racial equity, right? Who is a democracy for? Who gets to be a part of the democracy. That's you can't talk about those democracy without talking about race. The second implication is that the law features on both sides of this story, right? The law, the legal profession, the courts, legislation features both on the side of those sort of fighting for and envisioning a broader democracy, and on the side of those creating those systems that actually contain and undermine and erode our democratic institutions. And as lawyers, I think that's something that we have to recognize and reckon with. And then the third story is that the fight for democracy isn't just in the courts, and it's not even just in the legislatures. It's this interplay between grassroots organizing, movement building, protest in the streets, and policy change. So what then is the landscape going forward for democracy reform coming out of this crisis moment in 2020 that we're in? So I mentioned earlier that I think the scale of our ambition in this moment really has to be at the level of the first or second reconstructions, right? The level of the 14th Amendment or of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act. And for leaders, civil rights leaders in this moment, like Reverend Barber, among others, this really is a moment that we can think of as a third reconstruction, or a possible third reconstruction, sort of a moment of possibility of creating an inclusive multiracial democracy. So I think there are really four big long-term fights that project of creating a multiracial democracy out of 2020 really has to tackle. The first is we need to make sure that our political system doesn't screen away or isn't insulated from the kind of social and economic inequities that communities are struggling with, that is sort of the bread and butter of politics, right? In a democracy doesn't mean very much if the substance of elections if elections aren't talking about issues like economic justice, racial justice, access to basic needs of healthcare, housing, the safety net, right? That democracy is closely bound up in sort of the bread and butter of what communities need to thrive. The second project or challenge is, how do we rebuild or build anew the electoral system itself, right? Our biggest weapon, or one of our biggest weapons for holding government accountable, making government responsive. And so this is the fight around voting rights, around a free and fair election process. We had the ACLU released a study the other day looking back at the 2018 midterms and the gubernatorial election in Georgia, which those of you who followed that election, then Secretary of State Brian Kemp was running for governor against Stacey Abrams, the Democratic candidate. And there were a lot of allegations about really, really problematic irregularities in that election. That as Secretary of State, did Brian Kemp undermine, for example, the number of voting machines that were present in Black and brown districts of the state. And the ACLU recent report released the other day found that of the 300,000 voters who were purged from the rolls in Georgia in advance of the 2018 election, 60% of them, over 60% of them were purged, were wrongly purged from the lists, right? It was for a bogus reason. They were still voters. They hadn't changed their address. They were still very much, should have been eligible to vote. In an election where the margin was 55,000 votes, that 200,000 wrongly purged voters, that is 4 times the margin of victory, right? That is in a country where that's what's actually happening. We can't really call that a free and fair election, and we can't call that a democracy. And that's just one example, right? We're seeing that same story play out in so many states across the country, even right now as we come less than 2 months away from the November election. So there's this whole second fight around the electoral system, election administration, voting rights, voter suppression. There's a third set of battles, which really has to do with the kind of larger ecosystem or terrain on which electoral contests are fought out. So as Jeff alluded to in his opening comments, it's really hard to have a free and fair election when our media ecosystem, for example, is rife with disinformation, misinformation, fake news, when we have a few monopoly actors who own and control and therefore can shape both online and offline flows of information and media. That's a structural problem for having a real democratic election. Another structural problem is the balance of economic power, So a world in which we have unregulated campaign finance system, a world in which we have concentrated corporate power and systematic attacks on community and labor organizing, is a world in which we have really deep disparities of political power as a result. You know, in one study, political scientists found that in right-to-work states, states that have sort of union-busting legislation, Democratic vote share for the Democratic Party drops by anywhere from 8 to 10 percentage points. But it also results in a dramatic decline in elected officials who come from blue-collar backgrounds, which in turn drives a decline in economic policies that serve working-class constituencies. And so, you know, on one level, when we think of labor policy, that's, you know, not usually considered as part of the suite of democracy reforms, but understood in this way, right? Union busting, attacks on organized labor, and attempts to concentrate corporate power are very much about structurally undercutting the political voice of working folks, which has direct impacts on the responsiveness or lack thereof of the political system. So there's this whole third set of problems, which we can call sort of structural problems that are related to, but upstream from the voting system of voting rights. And then there's a fourth set of problems, which I think of as sort of election-proofing the policy outcomes. So, you know, let's say we have a free and fair election. Let's say that everything goes smoothly in November or in future Novembers. But if government isn't able to then actually pass the kind of policies that respond to people's needs, then how effective is that election really? Or how democratic is our country really? And so here I'm thinking of, for example, fights to dismantle the modern administrative state. You know, for those of you who followed this debate, there's a question about whether courts today are engaging in a kind of neo-Lochnerism, sort of invoking the attacks on social and economic regulations by the Lochner-era courts of the 1920s. These are, again, not normally thought of as democracy reform questions, but I think they're very much tied to this idea of, you know, if democracy is about a responsive government, even if you get the election part right, if government can't then actually respond, then how meaningful is that election in the end? So those are four big picture challenges ahead of us. In these last couple of minutes before we open up for questions and discussion, I want to talk a little bit more concretely about the road ahead and the way forward. And I do think that despite all the challenge, we are in a really exciting and historic and rare opportunity to rebuild or build anew our democratic institutions. So there are a couple of buckets that I would put the current set of fights around. The first bucket is really the sprint to November, right? We are less than 2 months away from this critical election. As Jeff mentioned in his opening remarks, the Trump administration has been singular in its open and brazen attacks on checks and balances, on the rule of law, and on the electoral system itself. And so any project of democracy, reform, or rebuilding has to involve accountability against those attacks on our democratic institutions in November. So that has to do with turnout, has to do with access to the ballot, safe and inclusive vote by mail. You know, these are projects that, you know, certainly our team at Demos, along with others, have been working on in states like Florida or New Mexico, Missouri, trying to get inclusive and equitable vote by mail policies in place so that all voters, but especially Black and brown voters, can access the ballot in the middle of a pandemic that is threatening the ability of the election to go smoothly. So there's a sprint to November around access to the ballot, around fighting the kind of voter suppression policies that we saw in 2018 with the voter purge that I mentioned and that are ongoing. Then there's a second set of fights that are really about post-November, but fights about structural reforms to our political institutions, right? So bills like the For the People Act that's sitting in the Congress, also known as HR 1, sort of a massive omnibus bill that covers everything from automatic voter registration to money in politics reforms to redistricting reforms. That's going to be a critical fight in January, assuming if there's a change in administration, to get that bill through. Then there's a bunch of other related bills, the Voting Rights Act, kind of restoration, now renamed in honor of John Lewis, to restore the VRA in response to the Shelby County case. So a whole bunch of bills around democracy reform that we'll have to go through. There's a third set of fights then around these broader structural reform questions. So how do we, for example, finally abolish the Electoral College that creates this huge disparity between the popular vote and the vote for president. By the way, I would argue the Electoral College is also a big reason why, for example, we have a presidential administration that is not particularly interested in responding to the wildfire crises in California. The Electoral College does not incentivize political response to states that are not swing states. And we're seeing that problem being played out in a dramatic and really dangerous, troubling way right now. So how do we abolish the Electoral College? How do we enfranchise and empower folks who do not currently have a political voice? So restoring voting rights for the formerly incarcerated, creating statehood for places like Washington, D.C., independence for territories in Puerto Rico. There's then a next set of fights which would try to get at some of those structural questions that I talked about earlier. So expanding the ability of workers to organize, constraining the ability of money to skew political action. So money in politics reforms, labor law reforms, reforms on corporate power like antitrust and financial regulations. This is where I would also put these questions about the media, right? Jeff alluded to the issues of fake news, disinformation, the current media ecosystem. It's in the long run, we're gonna have to have an answer for how do we have a democracy where the public sphere is online and where the platforms that run the online public sphere have a business model that actually profits from virality and profits from the kind of algorithms that incentivize both radicalization and the spread of misinformation. We're going to need an answer to that if we want to get a democracy that is going to work for the 21st century. So that's a lot to put on the table. I do think that this is, when I mentioned earlier the cases like Cruikshank, you know, in those moments, it's not just about policy, it's also about power and organizing and kind of bottom-up pressure from below. And I do think this is a moment where we're seeing that in spades, you know, from the movement for Black Lives to the climate justice movement, there's to the kind of worker organizing that is happening in this moment. We're at a moment of tremendous civic activism, organizing, kind of real energy in the grassroots. And I think part of the task ahead is going to be to build on that energy, build on that power and that momentum, and channel it into the kind of structural reforms that we're talking about here. You know, if you look at the Movement for Black Lives platform, for example, there's a lot in there about fighting voter suppression and dismantling systems of anti-Black police violence. And those are really, if we take democracy at its deepest level, those are fights about creating the kind of equitable democracy that we're looking for. So we're over the next few days, you'll have in this symposium a deeper dive into these questions around how do we ensure everyone is encouraged and able to vote? How do we think about the relationship between voting rights and racial equity? How do we think about civic duty in this moment? What I hope we can do is going into those conversations, sort of engage in them in context of this broader history and the broader structural reforms that need to happen. If we're able to do that over these next few years, I really do think we're going to have the opportunity to create the kind of real democracy that we've always sort of aspired to have in this country, but never actually realized. So I'm about at time. Why don't I stop there? I see some questions coming in the Q&A, so let me turn it back over to Casey and we can have some discussion.
Thank you so much, Sabeel. That was incredible. And I know that must have been especially challenging, just kind of talking into a void when you would normally be able to be in the room and interact with humans. So I really appreciate you making that a really engaging and wonderful framing for the symposium, despite the lack of human response that you got. Maybe there's someone in the room who's responding to you. I was smiling, I was engaging. So I hope you felt that through Zoom.
It's our coronavirus virtual relationships here. Yeah, it was all great. Thank you, Casey.
Well, so there are some great questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and I would encourage everyone to keep sending them in. And I thought I would just start with a question about rhetoric around voting. And this is a question related to something that those of us who are Twitter users have seen a lot of in response to people sort of jumping on the bandwagon of the Black Lives Matter movement this summer, and a lot of people responding with calls to encourage people to vote. And then responses from people who've been working within the movement saying, why are you so focused on voting? Electoral politics is not the answer for me. It hasn't worked for me before. You're sort of co-opting our demands, and you're just bringing it back to something which is a relatively uncontroversial statement, which is everyone should vote. And so I'm wondering, how do we balance those two responses, and how do we contextualize encouraging people to focus on voting without making other people feel alienated and making their calls to action feel just as valuable or valued?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Casey and audience. You know, it's a really important one, because I think so my view on this may not be everybody's view, but I do think that part of the task for democracy reform going forward is actually to embrace the deep connections between democracy reform and calls for economic and racial justice. And I think it's one of the reasons why I like to start these types of conversations with the analogy to Reconstruction, right? Because I think on one level we can say, okay, everybody should vote, that is uncontroversial, everybody agrees with that. But the thing is, everybody doesn't agree with that. And when you drill down to think about, well, why and who doesn't actually agree with something that seems pretty straightforward, it often, almost inevitably in this country, has to do with race. And so why are so many people convinced that voter fraud, which is statistically not a problem, why are so many people convinced that it's a problem enough to justify the kind of voter purges that we saw in Georgia, that we're still seeing in every state? You know, we're in active litigation in multiple states on voter purges, as are many other organizations. You know, that the reason why that argument is advanced is because it's helpful to some aspiring elected leaders to actually restrict the number of people who vote. And the people who get whose votes get restricted are predominantly Black and brown people. And that's because Black and brown communities have had to fight to be able to vote since the beginning of the country, of this country. So I would lean into the question in the other way and actually say, it's not that we think democracy solves, that voting once every 2 or 4 years solves everything, but actually we think it's a critical component to advancing a larger project of an equitable and inclusive democracy, sort of a democracy in its deepest sense. And insofar as people find that problematic, we've got to ask why, right? And I think part of what the Trump era is really forcing is, or it's revealing, how many elected officials, how many politically active constituencies really are only interested in a democracy that serves them, as opposed to a democracy that serves all of us, inclusive, particularly of Black, brown, Indigenous communities.
Thank you so much for that answer. And I am going to try to throw the mic, so to speak, or the video to my friend Devin Bergstein, who has a great wonky question for you. And we'll see if we can get him on video. There he is with a great background. Thanks, Devin.
I did not know it was going to be on camera, Casey. Thank you for that.
I know, I'm sorry, but we need more faces.
Okay. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I just had a quick question about what kind of anti-misinformation policy you envision would both survive First Amendment challenges and also, you know, I would say like legitimately respect, you know, the whole point of the First Amendment, which is to allow for free exchange of political ideas. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, and It's one that I'm super interested in. A lot of folks have been thinking about this. You know, it's a symposium topic in its own right. But there are a couple of things I'd say here. You know, I think this question is really about, I mean, it's about offline traditional media too, arguably, but it's really especially of concern in sort of the Facebook, Twitter, YouTube era, right? When so much information and public political conversation happens through online platforms. And the fundamental root of the problem, I think, is actually not so much about speech, but more about the structure of the platforms themselves, right? Because Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, especially Facebook and YouTube, are profit-driven business models that generate revenue by maximizing user attention and time spent on the platform. And the way you do that is by having algorithms that feed users more of the things that they like, and more extreme versions of the things that they like. It's sort of kind of basic human psychology. So what that means is that if you're on YouTube and you use a recommendation algorithm, or if you're on Facebook and your newsfeed is being pre-screened, it accentuates both polarization and radicalization, and it accentuates virality, the spread of misinformation. And then you have political actors that are strategically leveraging those features of the platforms, both for disinformation purposes and for radicalizing and recruitment purposes. And so there's a lot of study about, for example, the role that Facebook plays in boosting the kind of white supremacist, white nationalist organizing and violence that we saw in Kenosha in Wisconsin a few weeks ago, for example, or what we've seen in Portland and elsewhere. So that's all preview to your question, really, which is, well, then what about, how do you deal with this in a world where we also believe in the First Amendment, and we also believe in the importance of different viewpoints being heard and aired out. I think for me, there's a debate about this, of course, of how far we can go in terms of platform regulation and media regulation. But I think one of the biggest key features of that's often missing in the debate has to do with regulations on the business model of the platforms themselves. So if you think back to the mid-century, right, we created the FCC and we had ownership restrictions on media companies for a long time, right? And the argument was a small d democratic one, that how can you have a democracy in which one person or one corporation owns the telegraphs or owns the airwaves and can then put their thumb on the scale about what information flows. And so there's a way to read our First Amendment doctrine and First Amendment traditions as also being compatible with a set of anti-monopoly distributed ownership rules about media companies, which I would argue was the case for the mid-century around radio and TV. And essentially what we're looking for, what we need, is sort of a rebooting of those ideas for the digital media landscape. And so if you look at the work of folks like Zephyr Teachout or Jack Balkin or Tim Wu, they all have slightly different proposals, but I think what they all share, these scholars of democracy and the First Amendment and tech, is this idea that actually there are different ways consistent with the First Amendment that we can regulate the business models of online media platforms in a way that promotes democracy and promotes the kind of free and fair exchange of ideas.
Thanks for a great question, Devin, and for being a good sport about your video. It was great to see the sky not looking orange.
Anytime, Casey. Thank you so much.
Well, I think that where you ended with that answer, Sabeel, tees up another great question we got from the audience, which is, underlying many of the issues you're critiquing, in addition to race, which you've noted, is wealth inequality and the coercive power of the profit motive in American society. Do you feel, or do you believe these democratic reforms can be achieved without a fundamental shift in our notions of what prosperity and human flourishing looks like?
Yeah, that's great. I super appreciate that question. I think, the short answer is yes, that we can't have a democracy, or I'll put it another way. I think the ideal of an inclusive democracy is not compatible with the kind of extreme levels of wealth and economic inequality that we're experiencing right now. And I think that's actually not a very radical or even very new idea, right? If you go back to kind of classic small r Republican and Democratic theories of, certainly of the founding era, but even kind of throughout in the progressive era in the mid-century, there's sort of a consistent theme that a democracy requires at least not a flat distribution, but an equitable distribution of wealth, where you have most of the wealth concentrated in the working class and middle class, right? A top-heavy distribution creates problems for democracy, in part because, if once a society becomes so deeply unequal, it actually becomes cheaper and more desirable for the wealthy to spend their money to rig the rules of the game rather than acceding to the demands of a democratic polity, right? You get the return on, just put it in crass terms, the return on investment to sort of buy the enough state senators and Congress people and lobbying dollars and so forth. If you're a company or if you're Jeff Bezos, is actually really it's a great deal. You're much better off spending money to try to skew the system in your favor than you are, happily paying the taxes that you might otherwise pay, right? And so there's a certain point at which wealth inequality becomes a kind of a structural corrosive factor on democratic institutions. And there's also a degree to which, if we think that democracy is more than just formal rules of voting every 2 or 4 years, but actually connotes some sense that we actually value each member of our society equally, with equal dignity and with equal opportunity to thrive and flourish. You can't do that in a world in which the wealth at the top has grown by several $100 billion even during the COVID pandemic, while we have about 40+ million Americans who are food insecure and housing insecure just in these last 4 months alone. That is not a democracy, even if everybody's able to vote, right? At a certain point, and this goes actually back to your first question too about this question, well, why should this idea that we're trying to respond to people's immediate urgent needs in terms of insecurity from state-sponsored violence, insecurity from the structural violence of the economy, to just say to folks in that position that we'll go vote in November is actually that's not an answer, because go vote in November is only step one of ideally then also getting government to respond to those needs. Otherwise the vote is irrelevant, right? So I do think there's a feedback loop ideally between a more equitable economy and a more responsive democracy. Right now we're in sort of the really bizarro, dangerous, vicious version of that feedback loop, where we have a feedback loop between economic inequality and anti-democracy, right? And what the struggle we're in now is to force us from that bad equilibrium to a more equitable, inclusive equilibrium that hopefully feeds itself and sustains itself going forward.
Great, thank you for that. And I think that we are passing the 1 hour mark, which I know is like a tough place to be on Zoom. So if anybody has any last burning questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat. And otherwise, I think we'll be wrapping up pretty soon. So this question is about constitutional amendments, because obviously some of the reforms that we're talking about require an amendment to pass. And given how difficult that might be, what do you think is the most pressing reform that would warrant an amendment to the Constitution? Not to, put you on the spot, to pick one.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to be put on the spot, in part because Demos, our organization, in fact, released our own proposal of a right to vote amendment just a few weeks ago, and you can see it on our website at demos.org, and happy to circulate it. But the basic gist of this is, first of all, we have legislative vehicles teed up and ready to go, right? I mentioned the For the People Act, and that's critical for a new Congress to advance that. And that includes a lot of the fixes for the kinds of things that we talked about today. But I do think there's, it's a moment to sort of also think bigger, right? If Reconstruction required the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and if suffrage required the 19th Amendment, then we should be thinking at the level of constitutional amendment ambition. And I do think that the Constitution should be more than just a one-line, overturn Citizens United, or a one-line, constitutionalize the right to vote. separately, we can talk about why the 15th Amendment was as weak as it was. It has to do, there's an interesting history there. But the right to vote amendment that we've put forward out of Demos is really a kind of all of the above, like a holistic look at what the 14th Amendment should have said or needs to say to embed the commitment to democracy that we're talking about here. And that includes everything from the abolition of the Electoral College to constitutionalizing the right to vote in a way that is robust against the kind of behind-the-scenes voter suppression, voter purge tactics that we talked about, and includes, for example, protections against losing the right to vote for felony convictions, to name a few things. And so that's not one policy answer, but I actually think one of the things that democracy reform advocates have learned over the years is that trying to do it piecemeal is not effective, right? Even if we overturn Citizens United but don't deal with voter suppression, we have not made it very far. And actually, there's a way in which by Voltroning all of them together into one omnibus, right, is actually politically helpful, but also on the merits, the right thing to do. And so that's the strategy behind HR 1. It's also the strategy behind the right to vote amendment that we've put forward.
I think you used the word Voltroning.
I did.
And I really liked that.
I'm an older millennial, so I'm just...
No, I really liked it. I got it. I hope some others in the audience appreciate it too. So I think our last question, I'm trying to capture some of the other questions here. Some people are wondering, how do we make voting rights a nonpartisan issue, and how do we address the issue of voter participation, especially in poorer communities who just haven't felt that voting is really a way to address their immediate needs? And I think I'm just going to go ahead and ask you to think about answering this question from the perspective of we, everyday people. What can we do with the people we interact with our families, within our communities, to work on these issues?
Yeah, totally. No, I appreciate that in the frame. And the most effective form of organizing, voter organizing, is in individuals in their own communities, right? So just in your own networks and in your own kind of the folks who you're in interaction with, right? That is actually the most effective way of organizing people for November and beyond. So I super appreciate that frame, Casey. A couple things I'd say about this. One is that we found, and anyone who's done this work on the ground will say that it's really important to connect the election and voter participation to those immediate bread and butter challenges, questions, economic, racial, social inequities that folks are struggling with every day. So I'll give an example from New York, right? When, one of the things that we had worked on here in New York around the 2018 midterms was there was a series of democracy reform, money and politics reform policies that were on the table. And also we, like the Bay Area, face a huge housing affordability crisis. And what we found is that, in knocking on doors, working with our grassroots partners, Community Voices Heard here in New York, what they found was actually, it was only when connecting those two issues, the issue of housing affordability with what is happening in Albany and our state capital, and why showing up to vote is like a critical first step to solving the immediate housing crisis. That's when things really stick, right? The idea that you should vote because it's your civic duty is not helpful. But the idea that we have to vote because that is how we actually start to solve the problems in our communities, that's a different argument and much more compelling. Now, on the nonpartisan piece, I think this is a tougher one in some ways, right? Because we've seen a partisan politicization of the electoral system itself, which is a dangerous place to be as a democracy, right? When one party has sort of explicitly weaponized attacks on the legitimacy of the democratic process. I mean, here I think there are two arguments that I would offer. One is that blue states are not necessarily better than red states when it comes to voting rights, right? New York, California, and California are two good examples. Especially New York is near the bottom in terms of access to the ballot. Really onerous voter registration policies. We actually want people to, if people participate, that would actually force even a blue state to do policies very differently. And I think this is why focusing on those bread and butter issues, the immediate issues facing communities, is important. I think the other argument to make here is that, there's one thing about, it's one thing to say we might have a disagreement about public policy, and that's fine, right? It's another thing to say that, to have a disagreement about who even gets to participate in the debate in the first place. And to me, voting is about that. Voting is about, that's how we hash out our disagreements, by electing representatives who then, can strike deals and cut bargains and negotiate in our legislatures. And so if we have a policy disagreement, that's totally fine and fair game. Let's have a free and fair election and, hash it out in the political process. But trying to kneecap the ability to vote in the first place, that's something else, right? That's no longer than us being in this same democratic experiment together.
Well, thank you so much. I think that's a great place to wrap things up. And I'll just say thank you again, Sabeel, for your amazing introduction. I think that was an incredible way to kick off the symposium and make sure we're really foregrounding the right issues as we have these conversations. And I want to thank all the people out there, wherever they are. We can't see them, but we feel your good energy. And we can't wait for you to join more panels. And I'll just do one final plug for the Law Review's website. If you go to our website and choose events, you can register for more panels and check them out. And you can also find us on Twitter, where we're trying to do some live tweeting, so to speak. So please follow along, please post. And thank you again, Sabeel. This was great. And I hope everybody stays safe and healthy out there.
Thanks everybody for this great conversation. Good luck with the symposium, and we'll keep these conversations going.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.